My name is Jody Tucker, and this is my presentation over the Greco-Egyptian culture during the Ptolemaic dynasty. Alexandria, a product of Alexander the Great. As once stated by Alexander the Great, I would rather live a short life of glory than a long one of obscurity. The thesis of this research paper is rather lengthy, so I'm going to summarize the high points for you. Pre-Alexander, Egypt was an extremely proud culture and one of the oldest civilizations known to man. Throughout their entire existence, very little evolution was done to their artworks. It pretty much remained the same, as in they liked to highlight their culture, their rituals, their beliefs. However, after Alexander added Egypt into his empire, their artworks began to shift drastically, and they no longer highlighted the cultural pride, but instead they tended to focus on individuals and acknowledging a single person as opposed to their culture. So the focus of this paper is to define what attributes the Egyptian culture adopted from the Greek culture and why exactly it was that Alexander was able to influence such a strong culture. Previous scholars and historians have covered both the Greek and Egyptian culture. For instance, Thomas R. Martin covered the Greek culture in his book Ancient Greece from Prehistoric to Hellenistic Times. In his book, he has chapters that cover the section of the Dark and Archaic Ages, the Persian and Peloponnesian Wars, Alexander the Great, and the Hellenistic period. Hoyt Hobbs and Bob Breyer are two scholars that covered the Egyptian culture. They wrote the book Ancient Egypt, Everyday Life in the Land of the Nile. During this book, they write about the rituals and the ancient traditions the Egyptians used to highlight in their artwork, and the stylistic changes that developed during the Ptolemaic dynasty. These scholars do an excellent job to cover the cultures, but what is lacking is the influence that Alexander the Great had on the Egyptian culture. To better understand the influences Alexander bestowed on Egypt, a quick analysis of each culture is necessary. The Egyptian culture influenced ancient Greece in the recreation of statues and sculptures. For example, the two photos shown here are both from Greek and Egyptian cultures. The first image is the Kuros found in Greece, while the other is a statue of a pharaoh found at Luxor Temple in Egypt. The statue of the pharaoh at Luxor Temple was created first, and the influences it had bestowed on its fellow Greek sculpture is clearly evident. Both sculptures are freestanding, they are both facing forward, and they are both equipped with the contrapposto style, with the left foot leading and the arms stiffly. As time evolved, so did the Greek sculptures. Greek sculptures began to develop fluidity, movement, and more naturalistic qualities. While the men remained nude and athletic, the development began to focus more on a natural posture and a physique. The function shifted from temple and sanctuary offerings to more aesthetically pleasing and decorative features. A prime example of this shift is the Artemisian bronze. The extension of his right arm implies movement, and he is a pristine example of the human figure and physique. The fluidity of motion can be seen in the extension of his arms and legs, and how his weight is focused on. The Greek sculptures continued to evolve from the classical era into the Hellenistic period. During the Hellenistic period, the focus became more on portrayal of realism, recreate current and natural surroundings, and the development of the portraits. A strong desire to recreate their current and natural surroundings in order to better relate to the viewer. A prime example of this is the portrait of Delion, which is shown here. The hair of the Delion portrait is highly texturized and appears natural. The tilt of the portrait's head provides movement and lifelike qualities which are reminiscent to the classical era. What separates this sculpture from the classical era and into the Hellenistic period are the unflattering and natural facial features, such as the wrinkled forehead, the large nose, and the lack of symmetry across the eyebrows and cheekbones. The natural characteristics are opposed to the pristine features and focus on aesthetics, which were prime features in the classical era. This separation of styles is what highlights them. Now it's time to focus on the Egyptian culture. Ancient Egypt maintained a strong respect for rituals and traditions. Their artworks revolved around temple rituals and religious tools, maintaining order in the universe, and instructions for the afterlife. According to Douglas Brewer and Emily Teeter in their book Egypt and the Egyptians, the portrayal of people in artworks were believed to be a permanent abode for the spirit of that individual and guaranteed his or her eternal life after death. An example of this is a photographed page from the Book of the Dead, shown here on this slide. The page is portraying the weighing of the heart ritual, which is one of the many aspects the dead will encounter in the afterlife. This book was created to provide Egyptians with the necessary knowledge to join the gods in the afterlife, which was the sole focus of their artwork. In fact, the Book of the Dead was provided on papyrus for each commoner to put into their tomb, so every dead would have access to the afterlife. The Egyptian culture created artworks out of necessity as opposed to beauty. For example, the artists only created in an assembly line style, they only created an approved style, and they would repeat images for utilitarian purposes. Artwork was created to adorn tombs that would be permanently sealed and was not meant to impress the outside world or future generations. One example is the photo of the tomb of Kheti. The view of this tomb is how walls could be full of relief sculptures and paintings, and it's also the ending result of the assembly line production. For instance, one artist would come in and paint the red, the next artist would come in and paint the yellow, and one artist would come in and carve the reliefs. There was not what we would call a jack of all trades, but an artist specifically designed for one aspect of the artwork. There was no imagination of the artist, but it was created out of necessity. After Alexander conquered Egypt, the artworks began introducing Greek aspects. There was also the development of Alexandria, which was the prime city-state for the Hellenistic era in Egypt. There was a combination of Greek and Egyptian style, and there was the incorporation of creativity within their artworks. One example of this is the Ptolemaic pharaoh head. The headdress is common for the Egyptian culture, however the facial features and the curly hair visible from underneath the headdress are Greek attributes. The facial features are more realistic, and the sculpture shows more of a single person as opposed to a figure in an informational ritual, which was reminiscent of the Egyptian culture. Another example is the aloe eros. The body is relaxed and graceful, which is visible of the classical Greek era. There are details of leaves and grapes surrounding the sculpture's crown, which are associated with the god Dionysius. Like the Ptolemaic pharaoh head, the headdress is common for the Egyptian culture. In this case, it is the Shint crown. Both aspects incorporate Greek attributes, but keep the Egyptian headpieces. While he heavily influenced Egypt during his lifetime, Alexander left a lasting influence on Egypt even after death. A prime example of this is the Ptolemaic queen that contains the Greco-Egyptian attributes. The sculpture found in this slide is possibly Cleopatra, who was queen after Alexander's death. Similar to the previous examples shown, the curly hair is shown from under the typical Egyptian headdress. The newest aspect of the Egyptian attributes are the curves and folds in the dress, which are similar to classical Greek. Alexander left a lasting influence on the Egyptian artworks. Even years after his death, new aspects are being incorporated into the sculptures. Alexander was able to influence the Egyptian culture based on his strong personality, his claim of divinity, and his representation among gods and heroes. A prime example of this is the self-titled portrait located at the J. Paul Getty Museum in California, which is located at the bottom center of this slide. All of Alexander's portraits were created by Lysippos under the control of Alexander. Due to this, it left the results to mimic one another and set a solid precedent of how Alexander would be represented. Characteristics once used in representing gods and heroes were used on all of Alexander's portraits, such as the curly hair, the young vibrant features, and the deep-set eyes. Due to this, Alexander was always portrayed among gods and heroes because he controlled Lysippos' portrayal of himself. Another example is the Herm located at the Louvre in Paris, France. An inscription on the pillar of this object states this as Alexander, but the leonine hair is unmistakable. It is very reminiscent of the Ptolemaic pharaoh head, which was produced in Alexander's Egypt, but is easily recognizable due to the exact same curly hair. Combined with the headdress of a leader and the combination of Alexander's physical attributes, the Egyptians portrayed not only his personality, but his drive for power. This paper helped further the research on Alexander's influence on the Egyptian culture and gave a better understanding of the Greco-Egyptian artworks created during the Ptolemaic dynasty. The divinity propaganda used by Alexander is what placed him in a position of power over Egypt and was the catalyst behind the Egyptians' adaptation of the Greek styles and attributes. Future research could help support this thesis by determining the outcome of his divinity propaganda claim to other conquered city-states found in his empire.